Chapter 9. A Promise Fulfilled, and Christie's Younger Life. A Failed Chapter. Here is the story promised you on page 29, as told to Christie at his Catholic mother's shapely knee. It seems there has always existed a God, or it may be that he created himself. There is no doubt, however, that he claims to have created something he calls the world, though in context this must be extended to cover the universe, or universes too. Into this world he places various creations, roughly interdependent, though a certain amount of jockeying for position is evident in the early stages. Amongst these creations is man, and shortly afterwards woman. God gives this couple, known as Adam and Eve, something called free will, which means they can act as they like. If they act as God does not like, however, they will get thumped. It is not by any means clear what God does or does not like. The first thing Adam and Eve do is not to God's liking. It turns out that God knew this was going to happen, because he is omniscient. It also turns out that he could have stopped it too, because he is omnipotent. Adam and Eve are, of course, quite baffled by what is going on, but take their thumping with reasonably good grace. They even go on to have 3 sons. That's that, you must be thinking. The family must die out. But no, God has been making it all up as he goes along, like certain kinds of novelists, and he promptly reveals the existence of some tribes who have women with whom 2 of the sons, one having been prematurely killed, can mate and carry on what they imagine is God's plan for the world. But my editor at Collins says that all this sort of thing has been done before, and at a time when it meant something too. Certainly Rayner's retelling was better. My point is that when Christie first heard it, he lisped, I believe it all. As we all do, at the age of 2. One would have thought that, exposed to that sort of lying tale-telling, any vicious development in Christie's character could only too easily be explained. But no, for almost all of his generation, and indeed every English generation, had been similarly exposed, and patently none of them had had Christie's great idea. We must therefore look farther than this story in the account given by Christie's mother before she left us. From 6 to 9 years, you already know that Christie lived near a railway line. You did not until now know that it was at Tiptree in Essex. From birth to 6, he lived with his mother in a converted railway. Already a no doubt significant conjunction. Carriage, on the edge of the salt flats at Malden, also in Essex. At 9, the closely knit family moved to the metropolis, scenting excitement, Woolworths, and the British Home Stores in King Street, Hammersmith. So Christie had become quite a globetrotter by the age of 10. You must be curious about Christie's father. So am I. Christie went to a secondary school in Hammersmith. Bernie Berkovich was his best friend. When I grow up, Bernie had told Christie, I'm going to be a traveller in ladies' underwear. When he did grow up, Bernie became a drummer in an Irish show band and saw his girlfriend killed in a car crash. Christie lost touch with Bernie after that, as you might expect. They were very young for such things. The points of the compass, carried out in brass and 10 feet from north to south, were let into the floor of the second hall. The wood blocks wearing quicker than the brass, the letters and lines protruded slightly prior to each ear. By the time Christie was in attendance, they were sufficiently so to be the cause of several accidents each term. The headmaster would do nothing to relieve the condition. He maintained that the object was an antique, and that it did not cause accidents in any case, since it was children running into it which did that. Christie himself fell over it 3 times, the second injuring his left knee so badly that it left his left leg a permanently twisted misshape. Other things left other marks too. Piggy Webb, the woodwork master, cooked his lunch over the glue pot gas ring, threw chisels at inner tents. Mr. Tripp, the Welsh wizard, waxed fiery every history lesson over the cunning of the English. Mecca, the P.E. master, had them all in a triangle, himself at its apex, on Parents' Day, bent at the knees, arms raised, saluting him in studied unison. I'm going to pack this in soon. Both everything and nothing in a person's past and background may be significant. Physically, Christie as an adolescent had no more than his fair share of spots and blemishes. Is that significant? Yes. No. Oh, I could go on and on for pages and pages about Christie's young life, inventing and observing, remembering and borrowing. But why? All is chaos and unexplainable. These things happened. He is as he is, you are as you are. Act on that. All is chaos. The end is coming, truly. It is just so much wasted effort to attempt to understand anything. Lots of people never had a chance, are ground down, and other cliches. Far from kicking against the pricks, they love their condition and vote conservative. The second reckoning. You should always see that you have proper evidence of debits and credits in the proper manner and clearness, if possible, and in the handwriting of the clerks of such places. In these offices the clerks are often changed, and each of these desires to keep the books in his own way. They always blame the previous clerks by saying that the books have not been kept in good order, and are always persuading you to believe that their way is better than that of any of the others, and for such reason they sometimes mix up the accounts of the said offices in such a manner that they do not correspond in any way. Pacioli. Christie Malry in account with them. Second. Debit. Aggravation. May 4th. Balance brought forward. £8, 67 pence. May 5th. Verbal aggression by Stegenson. Indirect. 2 pence. May 12th. Revelation of holy storytelling. £60. May 19th. Bernie Berkovich's trouble. Indirect. 23 pence. May 31st. Injury to left knee at school. £4. May 31st. General educational trauma. £35. Total, £107, 92 pence. Credit. Recompense. May 5th. Skater's legal action. £1.30. May 5th. 4 misshapes. 1 pence. May 31st. Balance owed to Christie carried forward to next reckoning. £106, 61 pence. Total, £107, 92 pence. Chapter 10. Christie codifies his great idea. Christie decided it was time that he codified some principles, for want of a better word, for his great idea. He took a whole weekend over it. These were the principles he thought of for himself. 1. I act alone. I do not seek the assistance of anyone else whatsoever. I carry out only such actions as are within my own capabilities. I am a cell of one. 2. It follows that I enjoy my successes and grieve over my failures alone. I tell no one of either, not even the Shrike. 3. My duty to myself is equally to attack and to survive to attack again. 4. I must not appear to be different in any way from those around me. I should appear satisfied with the job at which I am earning a living. 5. I do not need more money than I earn, and should not attempt projects which require more money than I ordinarily have. 6. I should not think I am cleverer than I am. After a major project, I should return to minor ones. 7. Every project is important, however small. 8. I am always attacking, when I am active, never defending. If I am defending, it means they know I am there to attack, which must never happen. If I am forced to defend, I am lost. 9. My chief advantage is that their system has classed me as not being clever enough to be known. To be effective, and to continue to be effective, I must preserve this unknownness next to my life. 10. While it is so important to be unknown, to be no one, from their point of view, within myself I must be constantly aware that I am not no one, that I am who I am. That is, I must hold closely to my inner knowledge of myself. If this were merely an intellectual and partial change, then I could practice holding my true self back by a change of location. That is, I could be my true self in my own particular knowledge, reserving that self for that one place. But I cannot do this. I must be that self, as well and all the time. while I am out, at all various places, the scenes of my intended triumphs. 11. I must not be present when an action takes place. I must resist the very natural desire to be there to see it when it happens. I must be away and hear about it, like almost everyone else, at some other hand. 12. I cannot afford to face superior odds, but I take heart from the fact that I have seen there to be innumerable occasions when the odds are quite indisputably in my favour. Christie did not write down these principles or thoughts, as I have, for especially the Shrike had eyes. Christie thought it was a weekend well spent, though. Chapter 11. Christie begins in earnest, and, something to please all model railway enthusiasts, an account of the little vermifuge. The most important thing is to begin, and to begin with a great spirit of decisiveness and boldness. A manual of 20th century archery. A little action. On his way home, Christie saw one edge of a poster torn at a corner, pulled it circumspectly as he passed, credited himself, debited cigarettes, papermakers, printers, advertising agencies, and the poets who work for them. At home, as the day waned, as it were, Christie reached out for his late mother's air pistol, loaded it, and poshed the streetlight glass outside with only his 11th shot. Afterwards, Christie picked up the telephone. Then he had second thoughts, and went out into Mall Road and round the corner to the pub, and used the phone there. He dialed Scotland Yard and told them, in tones of great seriousness, that he had just left a bomb in the stalls of the Aldwych Theatre. Time to explode in 15 minutes. Next, the National, he thought. But that was enough for one evening. Christie had one light ale, went home and ate sparingly, and then called by arrangement on the Shrike for a little comfort. You should beware of concluding from the above that Christie's intention was only a little mitching Malico. Considering his future, Christie saw clearly that he should remain at Tappers and not seek promotion or distinction in any way, but Wagner's section was limited in opportunities for credits to Christie. Wages section, he had seen, abounded in them, but how could he arrange a transfer? Christie suggested to his new friend Headlam that they might take their respective girlfriends, the Shrike and Lucy, to the Palais the next evening. Headlam thought this an excellent idea, and suggested that they meet the girls inside. In this way, Headlam went on, they would have to pay for themselves, or at least Lucy would. We're saving money to get married, he explained. But Christie was not as logical as that, nor mean, nor did he have plans to marry. So he paid for his beloved Shrike and bought her a vodka and tomato juice as well, which the genteel girl referred to as a Bee Mary, eschewing coarse language. The Shrike and Lucy took to each other, and after about an hour or so invited each other to dance. They said this was to give the men time for a drink together, but really Lucy wanted to sound out the Shrike's opinion as to the relative merits of circumcised and uncircumcised men. Christie and Headlam made for the bar, and even as the till rang, the wages man said, "Why don't you come and join us on wages? Do you fancy a transfer?" Did Christie? Was Headlam clairvoyant? Parsons looks like being indisposed for the rest of this novel, went on Headlam. In fact, I think he's just caught something fatal. But what about Stegenson? Doubted Christie. Stegenson will do what I tell him to do, said Headlam. I've got something on Stegenson which he knows I've got, and I know he knows I've got. There are limits, of course, to how I can use it, but in this case Stegenson can have no objection. But what about Wagner? Said Christie, leading him on. You'll find this difficult to believe, said Headlam, until you've been at Tappers as long as I have, but I've got something on Wanker as well. In fact, the same thing I have on Stegenson involves your section head too, besides others, and besides other things. It sounds as though you run the office, said Christie admiringly. Within limits, said Headlam. I do run the orifice. And with that the girls rejoined them. Christie was very relaxed and relieved that an important aspect of his future had now been settled, and reminisced charmingly as he danced with the Shrike about how they had met on this very sprung floor, and how everything was all right now, and was going to go on being all right, and would then become even better. He was very uncomplicated, Christie, and in the Shrike he had met his simple match. There were not many causes for debit during the first part of Christie's last week on invoices. To create a contra-entry to what few there were, Christie contented himself with taking home some paper clips, a rubber stamp pad, and similar small items of stationery. But towards the end of the week, for reasons which Christie could only assume were connected with whatever hold Headlam had on Wagner, his section head imposed savage work burdens on them, tongue-lashed him more than once unjustly, and generally debited Christie very severely. Christie spent the whole of one early evening trying to work out a balancing entry, time being short. It was clear to him that he could step up his transfer of stationery in volume simply by taking a briefcase or larger receptacle into the office. But there was a possibility of being caught, since Tapper's security section did hold random checks on departing employees to discourage the growth of a black market in smuggled walnut cakes and misshapes. Besides, there was the problem of disposing of such things as A4 bank paper, which burnt very slowly in bulk. Christie played back on the tape heads of his mind a whole Wagner working day, determined to find a better way of squaring the accounts. Finally, he stopped at the way his section head signed memos and orders, ran back, replayed it once and twice to make sure. Then he was sure, and could turn his mind to the Shrike's delights, which included dinner. It was another part of Christie's job at this time to collate and pass on orders, as it was of several other of his colleagues. These orders were of two categories, internal and external. The internal are what Christie was concerned with on this particular morning. The various departments of the factory, bakery, and office would all make out their requirements on the standard form and send it to Wagner, who would order it appropriately from an outside supplier. Wagner signed hundreds of orders a day, actually reading perhaps 1 in 10. They were good odds. Christie took his lunch early, 12 to 1, as the pattern of office routine allowed. Thus he was alone at his desk when all the others were out. Christie went to a colleague's typewriter and sat down. Riffling through a pile of his own work, he came across an order from sales department for 5 cartons of carbon paper. Christie typed an official order for 5 tons of carbon paper, went back to his own desk, and included the order with all the others he had done that morning, in the knowledge that Wagner's usual practice was to lift the corner of each of the piles just sufficiently to scrawl at great speed his wizened and entirely personal signature. And Christie wore gloves, rubber, of course, close-fitting, skin-coloured, the while, so that no link with him could be made. The perfect crime. You may look forward to the arrival of a lorry at Tapper's loaded with enough carbon paper to keep them going until the end of the century, for Wagner signed without noticing, as usual. As he had some time to spare before the others came back, and his gloves still on, Christie made out some extra cards for the calls file. This was an index system which acted as a reminder to do certain things on certain days. Each day, first thing in the morning, the cards for that day were taken out and acted upon. Christie hoped this would be, since the first reminded Wagner that he owed the chief accountant 4 kicks up the arse, the second that his secret vice was known to every girl in the office, and the third that every other section head was better paid than he was. And now for Christie's comprehensive masterstroke. He also put in a card attacking himself. Then he put in cards attacking Lucy and 2 other minor office celebrities, so that he would not himself stand out as the only one except Wagner to be the subject of attention. These cards would be picked out and read a fortnight after Christie had left the section by a Miss Drew, whose main characteristic was that she was never able to keep anything to herself, including her what used to be known as ample charms. It certainly made up, Christie thought, for the inconvenience of having to take his lunch an hour earlier. One day on his way to work, Christie read in his newspaper that the Home Secretary had dropped dead in the House during a late-night sitting. The cause was so far what the newspaper called a mystery. As soon as sufficient noisy work was underway in the office for him to speak unnoticed, Christie picked up the telephone, dialed Scotland Yard, and spoke as follows. Last night I got the Home Secretary. You do not know how I got him. Next I shall get the Minister for Trade and Industry, the Foreign Secretary, and the Prime Minister. In that order. You will not know how I got them, either. Then Christie put the phone down. He knew that even if the call were to be traced back to Tapper's, the exact extension, amongst more than 100, could not be ascertained. Christie hoped that the call had been recorded other than by a constable's ear. Were all incoming phone calls to the police taped? Why not? Headlam took Christie out for a drink at lunchtime on his first day as a wages man, in celebration. They both drank bitter this time. My father, said Headlam, took me into a pub on my 15th birthday, stuck a pint of bitter into my hand and said, like all the men in this family, son, you do 3 things as a matter of course. You drink bitter, vote Labour, and support Chelsea. The bitter took some getting used to, as I'd been drinking brown up till then, but I was a Chelsea man already. As for Labour, I reckoned if you wanted to get on in the world, you had to vote for the lot who had the money. But as I didn't have a vote then, it didn't make much difference anyway. Headlam paused to provide a paragraph break for resting the reader's eye in what might otherwise have been a daunting mass of type. I was soon persuaded my father was right, however, he went on, by an experience of some of those with the money. There was this girl who used to slum a bit down by the river, and she took something of a shine to me. And me to her, to be honest. She even introduced me to her family, who had one of those old houses along past the Doves. Sunday lunch we had there. Do you shoot pigeon, eh? What? Her father asks me. And no, I reply. But I do kick stones along the pavement at them sometimes. Christie was pleased to laugh. Didn't work out after that, said Headlam, though she was a fair bit of grumble. Madge, her name was. Madge. Christie warmed and warmed to Headlam the more he came to know him. Indeed, such was the conjunction of sympathies that Christie was tempted to reveal his great idea to Headlam and enlist his help in carrying it towards its inevitable fruition. But his principles stayed him. I am a cell of one. In that way he could not be betrayed. In that way he was responsible for, and to, no one but himself. It was the only way. It had been proved to be the only way. But in some ways, Headlam was certainly a help to Christie's aims. Unwittingly, of course, though providing these opportunities for credits which the first wages round had revealed to him. And there were soon other ways in which Christie was helped by the kindly clerk who knew everybody and controlled, within strict limits, as I have said, some of the things they did or did not do. Headlam knew about Tapper's governor's private lift, for instance, for Headlam had once been, Auntie Lucy, sweet on the company's secretary's secretary, and he was known and loved by everyone at Tapper's. Need I say more? On his first wages round in his new section, Christie put one of his plans into practice. He had been able to carry out a further reconnaissance of the boiler room on being asked by Headlam to go down and sort out a stoppages query from the same man Christie had seen on the first occasion. He had checked on the nature and position of the switches on the terminal boxes controlling, if he was to believe the 4 boilermen, the whole of Tapper's power. And he had contrived a method of throwing these switches by remote control, so to speak, in an unusual way which I am not going to bother to invent on this occasion. But I will go so far as to tell you that it involved a shovel, which was naturally already there and available for use, a length of nylon twine, and a small hard ball of compressed rubber, of the kind delighted in by many children of all ages. And that once this apparatus had worked, then the only objects left were a shovel, which had every right to be there, and a child's ball with about a yard of twine attached. Furthermore, since the ball had been chosen for its remarkable, even improbable, bouncing capabilities, it would carry the twine a considerable distance away from the shovel when it fell, and might, indeed, if it lodged under one of the boilers or in some other inaccessible place, remain unfound for a considerable number of years, not to say until eventual, for it comes to all, demolition. Christie set it on a Friday, payday, and since the timing of a device is dependent on the strength of nylon twine has definite aleatoric limitations, he could not tell when it would plunge Tapper's into darkness and confusion. It might happen before he went home. More likely it would occur over the weekend sometime. Or possibly it could still be primed early the next week. When he came back to work on Monday, it was no part of his duty to inquire as to whether there had been power failures that weekend. He was rigidly following his principles, of course. He knew there were certain continuous processes, doom, and the sugar boilers, for instance, which would be affected if it had occurred at the weekend, but that it would be better if it occurred during the working hours of the working week. There was no loss of power during that week, and on the Friday wages round, Christie noticed, as expected, that his apparatus was no longer in place. Either it had worked during the weekend, or it had been discovered and dismantled at some other time. Or it had not worked. Christie never knew. This novel is not an unrelieved progression of successes, you know. What I would like to, said Headlam, do is to make a discovery of the kind that a legendary employee of a well-known manufacturer of matches did. What was that? Asked Christie. He went to his governors and said he had an idea which would save them so many thousands a year. In return, he wanted a salary for life of half those thousands, and their governors were nothing like as dim as the tappers lot are. They agreed, and the man said, put sandpaper on one side of the box instead of two, which had never occurred to the governors before. Perhaps they weren't much brighter than our lot, after all. But they were honourable, and half of what they saved on sandpaper they dutifully handed over for the rest of the man's natural life. Haven't I heard that story before? Said Christie. I don't know, said Headlam, crying into his beer. I don't know. How could I? But since I seem to be the comic relief in this novel. It needs it, said Christie. Have you heard about the man who asked a pet shop owner if he had any dogs going cheap? No, said Christie. I don't think I have. Ah, said Headlam, in that case you won't have heard either that the pet shop owner replied that he hadn't. His dogs went woof woof. I wish I still hadn't now, said Christie, and it was his turn to weep into his bitter. It was at the end of his second week on wages section that Christie first became consciously curious about his income tax. Each week they have deducted it, thought Christie. Tappers. And now for 2 weeks I have abetted them in docking tax from others, including nut ladies, icers, and most of the rest. What are they doing? What am I doing? And Christie understood that tappers held on to this money they deducted for as long as they legally could, and sometimes longer, and collected interest on it the while, or used it to lessen the interest they paid on their various overdrafts, and then paid it to the collector of taxes. Where does this collector of taxes have his office? Asked Christie of Headlam one morning. Brook Green Road, said Headlam, just past the Palais. Just past the Palais, said Christie. Just past the Palais. Yes, said Headlam, just where it starts to curve towards the bush. At once Christie began to try to imagine what this collector of taxes did with the money he garnered from, together with Tapper's numerous others, Christie. He no doubt passes it on to the government, he thought, after keeping a modicum for his trouble, and he could at once think of innumerable things the government spent it on, of which he disapproved. The buggers, said Christie, who, I must point out yet again, was very simple. And it's with my money too. I shall allow no sublimination in balancing that debit. Luckily, no one overheard him. That very lunch hour, he set out down Brook Green Road to where the collector of taxes had his office. Hythe House. He was astonished to see the building was named. Hythe, Christie knew, was a variant spelling of Hythe, which meant a small port, haven, or landing place, especially on a river, now only usually found as a place name element, as in Rotherhithe, Lambeth, Lamb Hythe, and so on. So this building, though relatively recent, must reflect in its name some landing place on the Thames nearby. Certainly not the pleasure boat stage above the bridge, thought Christie, which is modern within my time, but another structure, older, hallowed by use from time immemorial, and enshrined in the consciousness of a cultured collector of taxes. Ah. And Christie reflected that since Hythe, or Hythe, was not found in any other Teutonic, as they will say, language, this collector of taxes must indeed be a true patriot, no mere macaronic dabbler, he. I shall have to think of something really special for such a man, thought Christie, for this is a collector who knows far more than mere debits and credits, fra lucre, filthy lucre, and so on. Christie prowled around his mind that night, as so often. And of course it came to him how he would acquit the collector of taxes. It was easy, the little vermifuge, he named it, the train. Next to Hythe House was a building site, the early stage of some extension necessary to contain the vaster amounts they planned to take from him and others, Christie imagined. The basic services were just being completed. Amongst them, of course, the sewage pipes, or, as they are more genteelly, the soil connections. They joined economically with those of the existing building, led off the ground floor executive cloakrooms, which had been closed for the while, and their exalted users provided with temporary, though no less comfortable, accommodation on the first floor. All this is necessary to understand, as you will shortly see, no doubt. Next day, Christie bought a clockwork train set. Already you can see what was in his mind. He was careful to handle nothing but the box. He had not heard about fingerprints in vain. Oh, no. Before making his duty and pleasure call on the Shrike that evening, he carefully put on rubber gloves, and to each of the 5 goods trucks of the train set he attached, by means of camera tape, a triad of gelignite sticks. Then he linked the wagons each to each in turn by detonator cord, coupled the whole to the engine, and wound it up. An ordinary, but small, alarm clock completed Christie's evening's work before he packed it carefully away in a polyurethane-lined suitcase. Where, you must be screaming, did Christie find his gelignite? I can't obtain gelignite, not that I want to, of course. And that is your answer. If you want gelignite seriously enough, then you can come by it. ICI makes it by the ton. Users use it by the hundredweight. Pounds of it are lost. Pounds are enough for some people. Christie wanted it more than enough. The Shrike loved Christie. Then Christie loved the Shrike. Then they both loved each other on the carpet in front of her gas fire. Christie was not too late home. He liked to be in bed by 12 or so. At the site next to Hythe House, he set the alarm to ring in 12 hours' time, released the catch, which acted as a brake on the simple clockwork mechanism, and, perfectly, his little goods train ran its moderately paced way up the clean 9-inch lead-glazed pipe until it encountered a bend under Hythe House, the radius of which was so small to permit its farther progress. So, after a clockwork squeal, it settled down to await the morrow. How touching. Christie by then had reached the Palais and was stopped by a police officer. "What's in there?" said the police officer, indicating Christie's suitcase. "Polyurethane chunks," said Christie, honestly. "Open it," said the police officer, who was only a constable. Other ranks, really. "By what right?" began Christie. "By every right," said the constable. "Open it." Christie did so. The constable was disappointed, of course. Christie discussed with him the possibility of suing for wrongful suspicion, or something, but was advised that he would be better off scarpering before he got nicked for the next thing that came into the head of the constabulary. I am told one has to put incidents like that in, for the suspense, you know. Next day, Christie and Headlam were amongst those who went to Hythe House at lunchtime and gawped. They were also amongst the lucky ones. They saw 3 bodies brought out and were in one of the television news shots. How Christie bragged to the Shrike when they saw the news together that night. For he had been on television, and she had not. But she took it all in good part, of course. The lovely Shrike. You begin to perceive a progression. Christie had begun in earnest. Chapter 12. Scotland Yard is baffled. "Someone," said a slatternly detective inspector, "is mucking us about." "Scotland Yard may be said to be baffled," agreed the assistant chief commissioner. "It feels like the anarchists again," said the chief commissioner, one of whose ancestors had been by Winnie's shoulder at Sydney Street. "The anarchists," said the other 2, nearly in unison, and their jowls shook in silent laughter. "If this gets any worse," warned the chief commissioner, piqued, "we shall have to consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons." Chapter 13. Christie argues with himself. I'm not trying to prove I'm right, but to find out whether. Brecht. Later, Christie argued with himself. This was not common for him, as he was essentially one and in accord. It was the first time he was aware that he had been more responsible than anyone else for a loss of human life. Christie argued with himself. Who would win in the end? Should he have had this argument before the little vermifuge, and not after? It went like this. I have no right to kill people. No one has, according to all the arguments. Yet people are killed. There are even licensed killers of people, of several kinds. Despite the overwhelming concurrence with the canon regarding the absolute sanctity of human life, in fact society saw that human life was in fact a very inexpensive, plentiful, and easily disposable asset. Of all things, human life was the easiest to replace. A machine would be difficult, costly. But the man who drove or worked or manipulated it could be replaced at very short notice by any one of millions of other men, all equally capable after a little training, all equally replaceable. Women were even cheaper. Human life is cheap, dirt cheap, according to this society, judged by the way it acts. The only true test, saw Christie, despite its pious mouthings. What it does in practice is not what it says it does. It does not care for human life. It shortens that life by the nature of the work it demands. It poisons that life in pursuit of mere profit. It organizes wars from which it is certain mass killing will result. But you know the ways in which we are all diminished. I should not need to rehearse them further. So Christie was easily able to become one again. If they fight dirty, and they do, so shall I, he thought. If they are so callous about human life, then so shall I be, though I could not possibly kill as many as they do. Those who disagree are missing the point. It needs to be said, thought Christie. Of course, the death of those near to one is distressing. Of course, the death of a mother makes one think she was indispensable. But if she really was indispensable, then you yourself die. Otherwise, she was not indispensable. And in any case, society does not. They do not share any concern for your mother, what she meant to you. It could not be society if it did. Christie could go on.